Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seat. A warm welcome to the OECD's 4th Annual Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. This year's GGSD Forum will focus on the topic of enabling the next industrial revolution, system thinking, or systems innovation for green growth. So we have the great pleasure to introduce to you our Secretary General, Angel Gurría of the OECD, to give us opening remarks. Angel Gurría came to the OECD from Mexico after a distinguished career in public service, including 2 ministerial postings as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Finance and Public Credit in Mexico. He has been the Secretary General of OECD since June 2006. And since then, he has reinforced OECD's role as the hub of global dialogue on debate around economic policy issues. Under his leadership, OECD has expanded its membership to include Chile, Estonia, Israel, and Slovenia, and enhanced our engagement with key emerging economies such as Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. OECD is now also a very active participant in the G8 and G20 process. Please take a seat.
There are seats here.
Yeah. And he has steered the launch of several high-profile initiatives, including several strategies such as on innovation, green growth, gender development, and skills. So please, Secretary General.
When your curriculum is longer than the speech you're going to give, then you're in trouble. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 4th Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum at the OECD. We gather here today in the wake of a defining moment in our battle against climate change. The historic agreement reached at COP21 on Saturday brought countries together to agree on an ambitious target for limiting the global temperature rise. The deal provides a strong framework for action for a new pathway to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future that could safeguard the future health and prosperity of billions of people. But if we are to secure a more prosperous and sustainable planet, both for our children and their grandchildren and their children, the hard work starts now. The INDC's intended nationally determined contribution, when you find an expression like intended national determined contributions, you realize how difficult it was to negotiate everything. Huh? I mean, this is the more complex name you could ever have found. When the intended nationally determined contributions to cut emissions submitted by, well, practically every single country that was there by now, even if fully implemented, we know do not add up to the level of emissions needed to keep the global average temperature rises below 2 degrees, and much less to the 1.5, which was the renewed ambition, very welcome, that came out of the discussions. So how can we close this emissions gap? Well, as negotiators recognize, green technology is going to be an important component of this solution. Article 7 of COP21 agreement is dedicated to technology development and transfer for mitigation and adaptation actions. It highlights that, I quote, accelerating, encouraging, and enabling innovation is critical for an effective long-term response to climate change and promoting economic growth and sustainable development, unquote. All the details still need to be figured out. We also saw the announcement of mission innovation. 20 countries, including China, India, and the United States, as well as some large fossil fuel producing countries, Canada and Saudi Arabia, committed to accelerate clean energy innovation by doubling their clean energy R&D investment over 5 years. The renewed focus on green innovation marks a fantastic leap forward. But we need to spell out what will be required in concrete terms, a sort of a roadmap of work. This forum can help chart the path that lies ahead of us. You know, it is a wonderful, fortunate coincidence of timing that you are here just a few hours, literally, after COP21 successfully closed. Now, today and tomorrow, we'll discuss the key elements of a forward-looking innovation agenda for the 21st century, which puts not only the climate agenda, but also wider environmental sustainability at its core. This agenda was recognized by ministers in a declaration adopted at the meeting of OECD's Committee for Scientific and Technological Policy held in Gurría last October. And I'd like to thank our ambassador. He actually stayed behind to put it all together, and then he came over and presented his credentials as ambassador of Gurría to the OECD, but already started serving long before in the preparation of the ministerial, which was opened by President Park herself. It highlights the importance of big data, public engagement, innovation measurement, international cooperation, and, as was mentioned here, the next production revolution all have to achieve sustainable innovation. We'll hear more about this from Korean ambassador later on. Now, one thing is immediately clear. Going forward, it will not do to limit the focus on green innovation to the green sector alone. Rather, when we talk about green innovation, we need to make sure that we're talking about making all innovations green. And to do that, to make all innovations green, we need to make a systematic approach to policy to ensure that green considerations are incorporated into our innovation policy settings at the outset, and that these are mainstreamed in every policy decision that we take. And here it's a kind of a double angle, because the first one is to promote that it is conducive. Second is to avoid the things that go against it. We just published a big book called Aligning Policies for a Transition to a Low-Carbon Economy, and basically it could have been very well called The Misalignments Stopping Us from Moving to a Low-Carbon Economy Today. Or rather, how do you undo with your left hand what you're trying so hard to do with your right hand, etc., etc., you know? It's all the things that we do wrong, or that we don't do, or that we should be doing differently. And that kind of task, when you're talking about innovation, which is so critical for the success, starts now, you know, on the day after COP21. And this is the first working day after COP21. So it's good that we're gathered together here. Now, the question is to have a focus also not only on the rate of innovation. That means how many new inventions, how many, kind of the pace of innovation. Everybody's very worried about that. It has a lot to do with investments of innovation, budget of innovation, and the division between the private and the public sector, who pays for the innovation. But also the direction of the innovation policies. Where is it going and why? And that's policy that has to drive that. Systems innovation is not just a replacement of one technology or innovation with another, like upgrading a gasoline engine with an electric one. It's about transforming an entire system. In this case, the car, as a fundamental concept, but also developing mobility solutions across the board. For policymakers, this implies a much more horizontal policy approach. When you talk about innovation, it must be, therefore, one that mobilizes technology, mobilizes market mechanisms, takes into account regulations, or ideally helps to improve regulations and have more conducive regulations, and also the social innovations that will enable the transition to a low-carbon, resilient economy. Now, at the OECD, we understand the need to take a systemic approach. The OECD project on systems innovation aims to rethink innovation policies in the context of green growth, to make mobility smarter, to make buildings and constructions less resource intensive, and all of the above, less polluting. Additionally, our OECD innovation strategy outlines 3 key strategies to transition to a systems-based approach. I have to say it's not our OECD innovation strategy, it is our new and improved innovation strategy, because we had one about 6 years ago, but you know, in terms of innovation, 5 years is like a lifetime, so now we've got a new one that we just launched, and which was the object of focus on the ministerial in Daejeon. So first, some of these strategies. Framework policies such as fiscal policies. They have to be part of the solution. Intellectual property rights, product and labor market regulations, they all must be adapted to support the entry and growth of young, innovative firms. This is the one area in the world where the word disruptive is good. You know, we all say that people are disruptive, or something is disruptive, or an event is disruptive. But here, we want disruptive. We can design smarter regulations to avoid stifling new firms and business models that can spur green innovation. In many of our analyses, we have identified a very clear bias in favor of the incumbents, and therefore a bias against the new firms, the disruptive firms, the ones that are erupting in the horizon. And that is something that we have to systematically avoid, and clearly policy has to avoid. Second, we need to reverse the decline in public funding of basic research and remove barriers to private R&D investment in green technology. In many countries, public R&D spending has stagnated or has experienced significant fluctuations, averaging less than 0.7% of GDP in 2014 in the OECD area. Now, total R&D in the OECD area on average is about 2.4 total. So the fact that less than a third of R&D, which is supposed to be about innovation, is dedicated to this kind of focused innovation, shows you that we are short. The 2.4 is short altogether, but then the proportion of this that would go into the total. Now, although private R&D spending has continued to increase, when it comes to longer-term investments in R&D, like in renewable energies or energy storage, significant barriers remain. And this is due in part to the short-termism of the demands under which managers in companies are, subjected to. They have to show short-term results. And there's a lack of early-stage financing for innovative startups. So the system is biased to favoring short-term and against looking at the medium and long-term. This is a structural issue that we need to do. And let me just suggest there is a very serious element of the regulations that came out of the crisis in order to be more prudent which is fine. Prudence is excellent. The only problem is when that goes, somebody talked about Solvency II, so you're talking about things that we created in order to be on the safer side of finance. The problem is, to what extent does the pendulum go too far, and then you get into a situation where this is actually stifling investment opportunities. The third is that we need to encourage innovative tools to help governments create what I would call lead markets for greener transport and sustainable buildings. This includes public and private funding for large-scale demonstration projects, biorefineries that turn waste into renewable energy, for example. This you can have a demonstration on top of the desk. You basically need to scale it up in order to see whether it works. And for that kind of thing, when it makes sense, when it is something that is promising, there should be more support. Now, carbon capture technologies. My God, how many times is carbon capture as an, we repeat it all over the place. CCS. Now we don't even say carbon capture. We say CCS and everybody knows. The problem is, again, it's not happening, not commercially, at least not generally. Some countries have already said, and if, by the way, you do certain types of coal plants, but it has a carbon capture, then it's going to be all right. So already that is kind of on the conditions, but the condition is not met, clearly, because we have very few cases, and mostly they are in the experimental stage. It will also require action on public procurement of technologies, such as low-carbon vehicles for public transport. The need for a systems-based approach is also at the heart of the OECD climate policy agenda more broadly. At the COP, we talked about this report I mentioned a moment ago. I really recommend it. It would be fantastic reading, even fun, if it were not so tragic, and the consequences not so serious. And we wrote it together with the OECD, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, the Nuclear Energy Agency, and the International Transport Forum. Everybody got together to write that one. So there was cross-pollination, which was very useful in terms of what cleared. This report is a first-of-its-kind diagnosis of these misalignments that exist between climate objectives and policy frameworks in every corner of the economy, practically in every country in the world, including innovation policy. This is why I chose to mention it here, because in many cases you basically have policies, government policies, regulations that basically conspire against the takeoff of the innovation when it comes to environment and climate. Now, take regulatory policy, for example. In many countries, regulations have not caught up with the pace of technological development. This hinders innovation, particularly in resource efficiency. Industries such as cement increasingly rely on waste as a fuel. This helps to reduce CO2 emissions and landfills. But in some jurisdictions, the use of waste in industry is limited by outdated regulations, which have not looked at that particular question, keeping this important mitigation potential out of reach. So, just an example, but again, one of the many in terms of the things we do that we should stop doing or do differently. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I have here OECD Green Growth Studies towards green growth, tracking progress. This is because the first one we launched like this was when we launched it in 2010, was it? And then 2011, when we were celebrating our 50th anniversary. And then this is because we now, and this one, the one we launched in Korea, the innovation imperative, contributing to productivity, growth, and well-being, which I would strongly recommend. It's good stuff. Now, a more integrated, systems-based approach to policy making is key to addressing so many of the complex global challenges we face. This is nowhere truer than for climate change. Resource depletion, life-shortening pollution. And when I say life-shortening pollution, I am talking about our lives, people's lives. We must think beyond traditional silos to deliver benefits to all parts of the economy and all members of society. With your help, we can define the critical next steps as we work towards a green and innovative transition. So I wish you a productive forum. Count on the OECD.
Thank you, Secretary General. Now I have the honor to introduce to you Professor Eric Beinhocker. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, or INET, at Oxford University's Martin School. INET Oxford is a research center devoted to applying leading-edge interdisciplinary approaches to economic theory and public policy practice. His research team is focusing on issues such as financial system stability, innovation and growth, economic inequality, and also environmental sustainability. Professor Beinhocker had, prior to this, 18 years career at the McKinsey & Company, where he led its strategy practice, climate change and sustainability practice, and McKinsey's Global Institute. So please, would you like to speak from there?
Thank you very much, Kumi, and thank you, ambassadors, and thank you, Secretary General, and thank you to the OECD for your continued leadership on this critical issue. I'm just going to get my slides up. There we go. As the Secretary General said, we just witnessed a defining moment in Paris in the history of the battle against climate change. And I think we should all recognize the incredible achievement, particularly of the French presidency of the COP and the UNFCCC, in negotiating an agreement which, as the Secretary General noted, is only a starting point, but is a very critical starting point. And for many observers of this, was probably at the high end of what was considered diplomatically and politically achievable. So what was accomplished? Well, first, there was a major shift in the architecture of the international climate deal from a zero-sum political negotiating game set by top-down targets to a positive-sum, bottom-up process that's creating a competition to show leadership on the climate issue. And there was a continued sense of a ratcheting up of ambition in the agreement, going from the 2-degree target that was set in Cancun in 2010 to a recognition that even 2 degrees is extremely dangerous, and that for many, particularly the least developing countries and low island states, that 1.5 degrees should really be where we're aiming our efforts. Also, quite importantly, a ratcheting mechanism was set to encourage countries to come back every 5 years to take stock of where we are, to measure the size of the gap between what we're doing and what we need to do, and then to encourage countries to ratchet up their ambitions. As the UN Secretary General said, this agreement represents a floor, not a ceiling. Also on funding, progress was made. There was increased recognition of the importance of adaptation, recognition for the damage that particularly developing countries are already suffering in the face of climate change, and further commitment to significant flows of support for developing country climate efforts. But I personally think the biggest shift in this outcome was the shift in the political environment that this is all happening in. And really the global conversation now has moved on from the whether conversation, whether we should do something, to the how conversation. And I see this meeting here over the next couple of days as a very key contribution to that how conversation. And as the Secretary General said, it's very appropriate the first Monday after the COP that we're talking about the how and what do we do next here. Now, just to give a little bit of framing for that how conversation, we should remind ourselves of the challenge of what we need to achieve. Now, the Paris Agreement sets this range between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees as the ambition for the global agreement. And this chart from the IPCC shows that even in this 1.5 to 2 degree range, we're not in the safe zone. We're still very much on the moderate to significant risk zone in terms of what the scientists think the risks are to the planet from increased warming. Now, if we look then at what leads to actually determining what the peak temperature is, what peak warming is, there's been some very good, relatively recent science showing that actually annual emissions flows is not quite the right way to look at it. And in some ways, the policymaking apparatus and political process is still catching up with this, because most of these nationally determined measures pledged in the Paris Agreement are in terms of annual emissions flows or carbon intensity targets and so on. And it turns out, as this graph shows, that they're actually not a very reliable predictor to what eventual temperature peaking will be. That rather what matters for peak temperature is cumulative emissions. What's the cumulative stock of emissions that we've put into the atmosphere and ocean system and Earth system since the Industrial Revolution? And these cumulative figures turn out to be actually a very strong predictor of where temperatures will peak. Now, one can think of the atmospheric and ocean and Earth climate system as like a bathtub. We have an emissions tap that is running, pouring carbon and other greenhouse gases into the system. And then there's removals from forests and soils and the ocean and forests. And we know that these emissions have been rising quite steadily due to economic growth, to economic development, carbon intensity increasing, and also population growth. And we also know that these net removals have been decreasing. As the oceans saturate with carbon, they can absorb less, and with deforestation and as the planet warms, the soil also releases more gases. Now, where we end up in terms of peak warming is in essence a function of how full this bathtub gets before we stop. And it doesn't matter whether going to 1 degree, 2 degree, or 3 degree. In order for the warming to stop, the bathtub has to stop filling. So this is a point that didn't quite come through as clearly as many scientists would have liked in the Paris Agreement, but we actually have to get to net zero emissions. We can't just cut. It's not a matter of cutting 50%, 80%, 90%. It really is 100%. That net emissions, net between the source and the sink, have to go to zero for this tub to stop filling at any temperature. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 6, 7, 8. So in order to meet the Paris targets of stabilizing between 1.5 and 2, at some point we're going to have to stop the flows into this tub and go to net zero. That's what the latest science and the IPCC was very clear on. Now, how much room do we have left in this tub? How much space can we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere? Well, there's also been some recent work on this, and at a maximum, 322 gigatons is about the answer. That gets us to a point where we have a 50-50 chance of making the 2 degree target. So that's the very upper end. Now, I've highlighted here the range of the Paris Accord. It could be, if we're serious about the 1.5 degree target, it could be much, much lower than that. But I'm going to just work at the top end of this scale, what's the maximum, and show you a few charts about what this means. So if we fill the tub absolutely to maximum and we only have a 50-50 chance of hitting 2 degrees, we still may well exceed 2 degrees. What do we have to do? Well, we can think of then this as a budget. We have this 322 left that we can put into the atmosphere. How quickly are we spending down the bank? How quickly are we drawing down our budget? Now, this is probably extremely hard to read. These are a whole bunch of IPCC scenarios and other scenarios because there's great uncertainty as to how fast are emissions growing. So we have to look at a variety of scenarios. But the answer comes out sometime around 2040. We've spent the bank if we keep going at our current rate. late 2030s, early 2040s, the atmosphere is full for a 2-degree warming scenario, probably even above that. So not very long. 2040 is not a long time away. Now, myself and my colleagues at Oxford have asked another related question, which is, given that our energy infrastructure tends to hang around for decades at a time, coal plants will go 30, 40, even 50 years, gas plants a little bit less, cars tend to be on the road 10 years or so. Given that huge momentum in our capital stock of emitting infrastructure, how soon do we have to start going to zero carbon on the new stuff? So as we add new power plants, new cars, new buildings, all the investment that we're making in our infrastructure, when does that have to go to zero? And what these curves show is the potential emissions of our the remaining amount of our budget left in this carbon budget, and then how quickly we're spending it down from our infrastructure. And the answer is about now. About 2017. That's when we have to, if we're serious about 2 degrees, that's when we have to start going for all new investment in the energy infrastructure globally, going to net zero. Now, again, being good scientists, my colleagues at Oxford make sure that I show you the range. There is a range and uncertainty on this. Now, it's possible we may have already passed that point. We may have passed it in 2005. We may already be committed with our existing infrastructure to an above 2-degree warming scenario. And at the very optimistic end, we might go out to 2030. But our best estimate is around 2017, 2020. So these results, which are fairly recent results, are add a sense of urgency to the challenge that we'll be talking about over the next couple of days that wasn't quite there in Paris. And we need to bring that sense of increased urgency that if we're serious about the ambitions that were set in Paris, if we're serious about the commitments that were set in Paris, then we need to be serious about taking this action to start reducing our investments in energy and other carbon-emitting infrastructure to zero very, very quickly. Now, at the same time, we've also done some work looking at fossil fuels and how much is in the ground versus, again, this bathtub, this carbon budget, how much can we burn? So there's also a stock of emissions sitting in the ground today that someday will get burned and thrown up into the atmosphere. Now, it turns out we've already discovered enough fossil fuels to take us up to 5 degrees, 6 degrees, something like that. We've already discovered more fossil fuels than we can ever possibly burn under the limits in the Paris Agreement. And if you actually add in the coal reserves, not just the coal resources, estimated coal resources, we can see that we are well beyond anything that the planet could possibly handle. So we will reach peak atmosphere long before we reach peak oil or peak coal or peak gas. And this raises an interesting question. If we've discovered more than we can ever burn, why are we still spending $646 billion per year of taxpayer, of all of our money, to discover more? And so this clearly has to be a question.
Mexican wave here.
Thank you. Well, and Mexico has worked very hard to reduce its subsidies in line with this. So, this is, I put it in big red flashing letters because I think it's a big question for the, for world leaders and leaders of many of our governments of why are you spending our money on discovering more resources that we can never use or never burn? So we have a set of choices ahead of us coming out of Paris. We can either do what the math tells us we need to do and drive new energy investments to zero starting right about now, and we can stop looking for more fossil fuels, or we're going to build up some big problems for later, and the choices are not good later. We'll either be faced with writing off a big part of our energy sector and replacing it later with zero carbon things, but writing them off before they're at the end of their economically useful life. So if you're investing in a new coal plant today, you're not going to get your money back. You're going to have to write that off at some future point in time. And so as investors, we have to ask, does this make sense? Or we're going to have to take a really big bet on carbon capture and storage that we can later on sort of clean up the mess and start absorbing carbon out of emissions and out of the atmosphere. And as the Secretary General noted, while those technologies are promising, they're still at an early stage, expensive, and have a lot of risk. Or we blow through the 2-degree threshold. Those are our choices. It's hard to think of any others. That's kind of what's in front of us. Now, some good news from that rather sobering assessment, that the first choice, moving rapidly to a clean energy economy, is actually taking us to a better economy. We're starting to rapidly learn that the products and services of the clean energy economy are actually better products and services. For decades, climate change was positioned as sort of a hair shirt issue where we're all going to have to sacrifice and drive terrible cars and live in terrible houses and eat terrible food if we want to do this. But we're rapidly learning that actually the smart houses are better than regular houses. Smart cities are more livable than regular cities. Electric vehicles turn out to be wonderful. I put a picture of this lovely Tesla at the bottom where you can have a software button on your dashboard called the ludicrous button that if you hit it, you'll go faster than any car should be allowed to go. And we have wonderful clean sources of energy that don't create the disease and other problems that fossil fuels create. So not only do we have to go down this route, but we will be better off for going down this route. And we're also learning that the economics of going down this route are a lot more favorable than were initially expected. And I'm going to talk about that more in a moment, or actually now. An important reason why this clean energy economy is ultimately going to win, it's only a question of is it soon enough, is because clean energy technologies are technologies. Fossil fuels are commodities. Now, we've done some work at Oxford looking at the very long-term price trends in commodities versus technologies, and we've collected data on hundreds and hundreds of different technologies and commodities. And it turns out that commodities basically don't change in price much over time. They drift around, they bounce up and down in what mathematicians call a random walk, but there's no long-term trend. I'll show you another chart showing that coal in the US basically costs about the same today as what it cost in the late 1800s. Whereas technologies come down in price and up in performance. Think of the smartphones in your pockets and the laptops that you have as being a very visible example of that. But it's not just true for those technologies, it's true for a whole range of technologies. And as I'll show you, clean energy technologies are very much on this kind of a price performance curve. This is a graph showing the price performance curve of solar versus, it's a little hard to see, but that squiggly line at the bottom there is coal. And these are since the technologies began, going back to, in essence, inception, from the first solar panel or the first coal mine. And you can see coal, as I mentioned, has hardly moved in price, whereas solar has dropped exponentially in its relatively short life. And then the red triangles are nuclear. And even though nuclear is also a kind of a technology, it hasn't declined in price largely because of safety and regulatory concerns. But if you look at these two trend lines of coal sort of drifting along and solar rocketing down, if you're an investor, which one of these would you bet on? Now, there's a reason why technologies like solar and wind and batteries and others come down in price over time. It's something called Wright's Law, which was discovered by this chap, Theodore Wright, during World War II, when he was looking at why were the costs of bombers and tanks and other things being made in the war coming down so rapidly. And when the planners did their budgets for what the costs of bombers were going to be, et cetera, they way overestimated what those costs would be. And so Wright looked at what happened, why did these costs drop so much? And it turns out it's what engineers call a learning curve, that as the cumulative production of these things go up, the engineers get busy and they find all kinds of incremental improvements and tweaks, and the prices come down in this exponential or power law function. Being an academic, I had to give you one equation. But what that means is that the price is very much like Moore's law, which we're all familiar with computers, that it means that prices can drop very, very quickly over time, and performance can also ramp up quickly over time. And we've done some work showing that solar is, in fact, following a classic Wright's Law curve, and you can then forecast this out with some error bars on it, these red and yellow zones, but it looks highly certain that solar is actually going to be cheaper than coal by sometime in the 2020s and 2030s. And actually, this varies a bit depending on location and how much sun and other factors. But solar is on a pretty good path to start beating coal in the next decade. And I could have showed you similar charts for wind and batteries and other technologies. Now, what allows clean energy technologies to have rapid improvement rates? Well, particularly technologies that have small unit sizes, so you can have lots of experiments. So, you can make lots of different types of solar panels and experiment with different ways of making them. Short times between generations, that the learning process can happen relatively quickly. And also it helps when technologies are embedded in a larger ecosystem of innovation. So, for example, one reason why solar has improved so much is it's benefited from improvements in the semiconductor industry that have filtered through into solar manufacture. And we may also see, even though people are have been recently more bearish on biofuels and biotechnologies, the immense progress being made in the biotech world will also likely start filtering through to that world. And this all speaks to the need for exactly the kind of systems innovation that the OECD has been advocating. And we can see that a whole host of clean energy technologies meet these criteria: solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, smart grids, smart homes, and bioengineered fuels. There's some other areas where it's a bit more questionable whether they do. And one of the issues we may find with things like nuclear and CCS is because the unit sizes are so large and the capital investments for the first few is so large that it's very hard for them to get onto that kind of learning curve. Now, given that we can see that these technologies can improve very quickly if the volumes come up and if the research money is spent on them, it creates a very strong imperative to begin shifting R&D and subsidies to clean energy technologies. And this is a chart from the Apollo project led by Nick Stern. And you can see that there's a huge disconnect between what we need to do and what we are doing today. That there's, while there's, the OECD countries spend significant amounts on R&D, only a tiny, tiny fraction of that is going to clean energy technologies. And likewise, as I mentioned before, we have huge subsidies flowing to fossil fuel technologies and much more modest subsidies flowing to clean energy technologies. So we need to have a very major shift in this equation of where the funding is going. Now, we can think of a policy framework for how we stop filling the bathtub in the following way. It's pretty simple. We want to make the good stuff cheap and better and make the bad stuff expensive. And it just kind of comes down to that at the end of the day. And how do we make the good stuff cheap? Well, we need to dramatically scale up investments in R&D, but not only just the dollar amounts, but as the OECD has advocated and as will be discussed in detail here over the next couple of days, we need to do it smarter, creating systems of innovation and embedding clean energy into these larger ecosystems of innovation and policy frameworks. And we also need to take steps that will drive up the cumulative volumes of low-carbon energies. To me, that's become the key test of whether a policy will work. Is it going to drive the volume up and help us drive down Wright's law curve? So, and there's various ways to do it, each with pros and cons: subsidies, feed-in tariffs, renewable portfolio standards, building codes. And one lever that hasn't really been used much to date is government purchasing. In other industries, the military, semiconductors, and so on, government purchasing was actually a key part of getting technologies down the Wright's law curve, and we should take a closer look at how it can be used here. And then also getting rid of the barriers to deployment, smart grid investments, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There's a whole host of regulatory burdens. The Secretary General mentioned some of them that need to be removed. And then on making the bad stuff expensive, as I mentioned, getting rid of subsidies would be a very good place to start. We may have carbon prices have been a bit dead in the water for the last decade or so, but we may have renewed opportunities to look at those. And there's been some good research showing that voters and consumers are actually quite accepting and even positive on them as long as they're upstream. If they're directly downstream in my pocketbook, I tend not to like them so much. But if they're upstream at the level of the utility or the mining company or petroleum company, voters and consumers tend to be much more enthusiastic. Now, as an economist, I have to say it all kind of comes out in the wash, and consumers end up paying for it one way or another. But there is an important psychology from a policy standpoint to how these things are implemented. Also, there's some very good work going on to encourage the full disclosure of the risks built into many companies from having stranded assets. Oil companies with oil that will never be burned, coal companies with coal that will never be burned, utilities that are not planning for a low-carbon future that will face stranded assets, and so on. And making investors aware of the risks in their portfolio from this is an important step. And Mark Carney, Bank of England governor and chairman of the Financial Stability Board at COP21, announced a major initiative to start creating reporting standards and disclosure of that risk that Michael Bloomberg is going to chair. And then also, one of the things that has actually helped tip the balance in the favor of renewables in many countries has been getting much tougher on public health regulations for fossil fuels and air quality. So air pollution standards, mercury and heavy metal regulations, things like that, ensure that the fossil fuel companies are starting to pay for the health problems that these power sources create, and that also tilts the playing field more in the favor of clean energy technologies. So where do we go from here? Well, the UNFCCC process is now sort of set on a path for the next 5 years, and we'll reconvene in 5 years to take stock of progress and hopefully ratchet up the contributions of the participating countries. But in the meantime, there's a lot to be done, both at the practical policy level, but also at the political level, too. And here I think the G20 could play a very important role in building off of the momentum of Paris. This is my G20 wish list. It may not be a politically realistic list, but it's at least good to have the wish list out there. That there should be a G20 clear commitment to net zero, because again, this issue was a bit fudged in Paris. A clear commitment to net zero would send a very strong signal to business and investors that this is the path we're going on, and that if you're making investments that are not net zero, you should think again as to whether your money is being put to good use. Also, a major effort to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, and looking at the potential to get some pledges or commitments to start winding down new investment in fossil fuel technologies in the coming decade, and also upping the ante and pledges for investments in R&D. And I think given how small they are today, even a 10x increase would be fairly modest. Now, I realize that this may be on the outer limits of what's politically feasible with the G20, but I'm hopeful because many of the G20 members played a key role in Paris in what was called the High Ambition Coalition. And I'm hoping that High Ambition Coalition will continue to work together over the coming years. So given that it is the Christmas holidays, this is what I'll be asking Santa Claus for my Christmas present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Beinhocker, for the illuminating keynote. Thank you. Now it's a pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is the Korean ambassador to OECD, Ambassador Jong Won Yoon. I'm sorry. So he was appointed to OECD ambassador role as recently as October this year. Prior to this, he has held several positions in government of Korea, including secretary to the president on economic and financial affairs, and at the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, he served as Director General for Economic Policy Bureau. And prior to arriving at the OECD, he served as Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund. So please.
Thank you, Kumi, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Secretary General, for your impressive speech, as usual. And I also enjoyed your Mr. Beinhocker's very inspiring and informative presentations. Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to have an opportunity to be here to make presentations at this very important forum. I was asked to make a scene-setting presentations on this supporting green growth through systems innovations. But I don't know why I was invited, but probably because that the Korea has actively involved in both of the green growth as well as innovations. So today I'd like to briefly touch upon the OECD's contribution to green growth, and then the STI ministerial meeting held in Korea last October. And I also introduced Korea's examples of green growth and eco-innovation. And then I will close by suggesting a couple of issues for discussions. We saw this picture already, and I'd like to congratulate everyone, including the French authorities and also Secretary General, for your leadership for achieving this, and for reaching the historical Paris Agreement yesterday. And while the 2-week-long meetings ended yesterday, but I think it is just the end of beginning. So there are a lot of things we need to do. So whether we will succeed in the climate change battle will depend on many factors, certainly including our efforts for green growth and innovation. So in this regard, I consider this forum is particularly timely and meaningful. Going to the OECD role on green growth, OECD has made a significant contribution to green growth, including the recent climate change issues. I'm pleased that Korea has actively participated in this process from the beginning. In the 2009 MCM Ministerial Cabinet meeting, which Korea chaired, the OECD adopted declaration on green growth. Since then, we formed a Friends of Green Growth group to discuss the strategy, and in year 2011, we adopted the Green Growth strategy. And following this strategy, in year 2012, there was an environmental ministers meeting, which was also chaired by Korean environment minister. There, we agreed on action plans on how to make green growth deliver. So since this green growth strategy was established in year 2011, the OECD has continued efforts to mainstream its agenda through this forum and sectoral country reviews on environment and economy. And some of this document has been already shown to you by the Secretary General. And while progress has been some uneven in certain sectors, but this year's tracking progress report indicated that green growth has been successfully integrated into economic agenda, and this is very meaningful exercise. So I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Secretariat for the achievement they made so far. Regarding the recent progress on technology and innovation, I'd like to introduce to you the Daejeon STI ministerial meeting, which took place in 11 years. Actually, there was a ministerial meeting in 2004, but this is 11 years ministers meeting on STI. And the theme was creating our common future through science, technology, and innovation. With broader participation of non-members, including ASEAN countries, it was a valuable opportunity to expand the outreach of the OECD on this issue. In the meeting, the ministers adopted the Daejeon declarations. It emphasized the importance of implementing well-defined national innovation strategy, strengthening impact assessment of public investment, and providing more opportunities for open science and global cooperation, and also maximizing STI's contribution to our better lives, including health. In relation to green growth, the ministers stressed STI's role to cooperate on climate change. They agreed on the need to strengthen policy framework to maximize its impact on environment using new technologies such as bioeconomy and renewable energy. Briefly introducing the Korea's green growth experience, Korea enacted the Act on Low Carbon and Green Growth in 2010. And we also established a long-term national strategy covering the period until 2050. And based on this strategy, the Korea has been implementing 5-year green growth plan since 2009. Based on the first 5-year experience, we have the authorities are implementing the second stage plan since last year with greater emphasis on innovation and technology. And the authorities are trying to create some tangible and actual outcomes. There are several important issues to address in discussing green innovation. For example, how to induce green innovation? Should it be based on regulation or based on market signals? Or what are the proper roles that should be played by public sector or private sector, and what would be the, how could achieve the proper cooperation between the two? And how to ensure effectiveness of all these policy measures, and what are the factors conducive to eco-innovation, and how to promote global cooperation, because it requires not only efforts of advanced countries, but also developing countries as well. So let me introduce a couple of real-world examples of these issues. The first is whether or how to regulate or deregulate to induce eco-innovation. As you are well aware, due to the existence of the positive and negative externalities and the resulting market failures, market forces are not enough to induce eco-innovation. The Eurostat survey in 2010 suggested that regulation is a major driving force for innovation. The OECD study, which was conducted in 2014, also found that regulation positively affects product competitiveness, in other words, innovation. But there are also areas where deregulation or competition should play a role in inducing innovation. For example, Korea continues to deregulate technically rigid laws or competition hampering regulations so as to level the playing field and to allow new firms to enter the market. However, it doesn't seem to be very easy to decide the appropriate level of regulations or carbon pricing. The stable and predictable environment for eco-investment will be critical in fostering innovation by reducing the uncertainties related to the eco-investment. On the relation between public and private sector, there are distinct separate roles for each sector to play. Nevertheless, one area that the public and private sector could cooperate is that the public sector catalyzes the private firms' green innovation. Korea has established 17 innovation centers as platforms for private and public partnership. They nurture innovative technologies and support R&D startups. During the Daejeon ministerial meetings in last October, I had pleasure of accompanying the Secretary General to visit the Daejeon Innovation Center. There we met with Tegway, this is the name of the venture company, which tries to commercialize devices for wearable battery. So it's shown in the bottom pictures. This device uses flexible fabric material instead of hard ceramic to generate electricity based on the difference between body temperature and outside temperature. So it can be developed into a portable appliance without battery. It won the Grand Prix Award for top 10 technologies to change the world by UNESCO. So without our innovation center. I don't know whether this device could be successfully commercialized. Collaboration among central, regional government and the private sector are also important to bring successful outcome. For example, Jeju province in Seoul is trying to making its island carbon-free by using renewable energy and promoting electric vehicles. Eco-friendly energy towns in Hongcheon, this is in Gangwon province in South Korea, is another example of such collaboration. These initiatives would not have been possible without concerted efforts of related, very diverse groups. While individual policies and each and every technical innovations are important, but they do not guarantee the desired green outcomes. For instance, despite the multifaceted efforts, the greener transition of industry and investment in Korea is not yet evident. Is it due to insufficient price, the policy or price signal or something else? So globally speaking, the CO2 emissions per car have been dramatically reduced across countries since 2000, as shown in the chart. However, global transport CO2 emissions kept increasing as a whole during the same period. So there seems to be a clear need for more comprehensive approach or systems innovation in order to bring broader and meaningful changes into the society. Global dissemination of technology, financial resources, and the capacity building, all this will be important in achieving global green outcomes. One such example is the first GCF funding project agreed upon last month. The Amazon Wetlands Protection Project in Peru tries to preserve Amazon forest by encouraging biobusiness, non-using timber, and supports renewable energy system. At COP21, North Korea did not submit the NDC, but they pledged to engage in global environment efforts through reforestation. South Korean NGOs are also currently supporting this reforestation project in North Korea. So if this green innovation is diffused and transferred more easily, then international community will be able to address global environmental challenges more effectively. So this is my last slide, and before closing, I'd like to cast a couple of questions for the following discussions. And there have been many studies and discussions on the green innovation, but there are many questions still need further clarification. For example, how to foster enabling environment for green innovation. Currently, market incentives doesn't seem to be enough to bring technological breakthrough in the green area. And as the professor indicated, I don't know whether is good thing cheap enough or is the bad thing expensive enough. How to provide proper incentives and enough incentives for green innovation from a mechanism design context. How to enhance public awareness, and also how to ensure international cooperation in disseminating green innovations. These are all important issues, and I think the OECD should continue to play a critical role in addressing these issues. I'll stop here, and I look forward to the fruitful discussions on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wu, for the reporting back from the Science and Technology Ministerial, as well as some of the tips and recommendations. And thank you very much, Secretary General, for having joined us. Thank you.
Okay. Eric, thanks a lot. Thank you.
So I would just like to, for the remaining time we have, outline what we expect to achieve or to do in the next day and a half or so during this GGSD Forum. And again, thank you very much for the three speakers who set the scene very appropriately for the next day and a half of work to do. Just a little bit of a background on why the OECD set up this Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. We set this up back in 2012 in order to help to fill knowledge gaps in critical cross-cutting areas that are important for green growth agenda. The forum it happens once a year, and it's the most important green growth event on the OECD calendar. We intend to provide a unique platform to give a dedicated space for multidisciplinary dialogue on green growth. And this is because we recognize that we cannot deliver in green growth without coordination across government ministries, across OECD committees, and through our partnership with businesses and other civil society segment. So let me just outline what we are going to do. For the rest of the day, we're going to break in a while for coffee break. But after that, we're going to have the first plenary session after the coffee break, and I would like to take this opportunity to welcome delegates from the Working Party on Technology and Innovation Policy, with whom we are having the following session as a joint session. It will be chaired by the Working Party's chair, Mr. Jerry Sheehan. And then after that, we're going to break for cocktail. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of that session. Tomorrow, day 2, we are going to start with a second plenary session that will look into the emerging technology and firm dynamics implications for green growth. For that session, we are fortunate to have the chair of our Working Party. It's a committee on industry, innovation, and entrepreneurship, Mr. Eric Beinhocker, who will be chairing that session. And then after that, we're going to have the third plenary session, which we will going to focus on the role of new data sources for green growth. And there we're going to talk about satellite imaging, drones, big data. So that should be also a very interesting session. Then after that, we're going to break for lunch. But then we hope that many of you will stay for lunch instead of going off, because we will have a side event organized by colleagues from UNEP to launch their report on technology innovation for green economy in developing countries. And that will take place not in this room, but in one of the other rooms. We'll come to that at that moment. And in the afternoon tomorrow, we are going to break into 3 smaller groups that will hopefully encourage more interactive discussion amongst the delegates here. The first one is, first group will look at the emerging technologies, risk, trust, and public engagement. Second group will look at the issues concerning international cooperation and research and technology. And then the third group will be discussing the need for better innovation measurement and learning. And following the breakout, we will all reconvene back in this room so that we can hear from the 3 moderators from the 3 breakout sessions to report back. Now, in all these sessions, what we hope to achieve is to identify 3 things. First, best practice. Second, key knowledge gaps in all these different aspects that different sessions are going to talk about. And finally, importantly, priorities or suggestions for further work priorities. Not necessarily for OECD, but for the wider research community and for governments. And then just a few logistical notes. We were trying at this event to reduce the amount of paper. So we have a limited number of hard copies of all the issues notes at the back of the room, but everything is available on the conference website. And finally, we have a Wi-Fi zone in the OECD conference facility. All you have to do, if you haven't figured out by now, is hotspot OECD, and that should not require any password. So we will reconvene at 4 o'clock